Hi, I'm Creegan. I'm Chair of the Board of Trustees at Scottish Adoption. I've been involved with Scottish Adoption for more than 10 years, initially as a panel member and since 2008 as Chair of Trustees. I got involved with Scottish Adoption because I'm adopted myself, and I believe really passionately that people with lived experience of adoption need to be at the heart of decision making. After 8 years as Chair of Trustees, though, I've decided that it's time to move on and to enable someone else to take on the role. It'll be a privilege for them, as indeed it has been for me, and I'll be really sorry to go. Scottish Adoption's been a big part of my life. But it's in the interests of good governance for any organisation to renew and refresh leadership roles. Looking back, and particularly doing so during National Adoption Week, provides a moment to reflect a little bit on the organisational journey that we've been on at Scottish Adoption for the last decade, and also to reflect a little bit on the changing role and meaning and experience of adoption in our society. And I think there's a similar story to be told about both. I was adopted back in the early 1960s. Adoption was very different back then. It was a classic story of its time. I was born to a single Catholic mother, and adoption was judged to be not just in my best interests, but indeed in hers. And that was a moral judgment about her circumstances. Nowadays, thankfully, we don't make those kinds of moral judgments about a mother's marital status. And the circumstances in which children and young people are adopted and where it's considered to be in their best interests are very different. More often than not, sadly, it's because of a degree of neglect, sometimes even abuse. Very difficult circumstances, very traumatic circumstances in which it's considered that the best interests of the children are not served by the parenting that can be offered by their birth parents. Children these days who are adopted grow up often knowing far more about their birth families, their birth mother, their birth father than I did when I was growing up. And with the advent of social media, the whole business of finding out about your past as an adopted person has changed a great deal. The business of tracing your birth family is very different to the experience that I had back in the 1980s and 1990s. But my experience of working with this generation of adopted children and young people is that despite the fact that the things that led to our adoption, what they know about their families of origin, despite the fact that those things are very different, there's something about the core experience of adoption that endures. As adopted people, we grow up removed from our birth families, and our experience of permanence and stability within families is very different from that of other children who grow up in their birth families. We have, if you like, a different hinterland. And for them and for me, adoption is not just an event. It's not just something that happens to you when you're a baby, when you're a child, or indeed a young person. It's actually a lifelong journey. It's part of your identity, and it's a part of your identity that endures. You respond to it in a way that changes over time. There are implications that you can't know about when you're younger. There are things about being adopted that aren't always predictable. I've been really proud to be able to bring some of the experience, some of the lived experience that I have of adoption to Scottish Adoption and to the journey we've been on as an organisation. Scottish Adoption as an organisation is very different now to the one I joined 10 years ago. Although we've been around for more than 90 years, I'd say that the journey we've been on over the last decade or so has been one of the most critical in our history. We have, I think, developed, we've grown, we've matured, we've responded to a lot of changes, a lot of pressures in terms of policy and legislation, the financial context in which we have to operate as an organisation. All of those things have changed a great deal. And I think we've responded to those changes really well. And I'm really proud, in particular, of the staff team at Scottish Adoption for taking us on the journey that we've been on. What has endured is our commitment to quality, to providing us services which recognises that the most fundamental thing that we do as an organisation is make a difference to the lives of children who are adopted. We make a difference to their long-term futures. And we do that with great care, with great sensitivity. We recognise that it is primarily about them, but it's also about others, particularly birth parents, particularly birth mothers themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the whole process of adoption can be a very traumatic one for many of the people involved. But it's also something that can lead to great longer term outcomes, great joy for everyone involved, and fantastic security and opportunity for children and young people who are adopted. One of the things that I'm very proud of is the work that we've done to develop and contribute to the development of a much more diverse pool of adopters in Scotland. Particularly, for example, the growth of adoption amongst LGBT people, where I think we played quietly, sometimes, a very pioneering role at Scottish Adoption. And I'm particularly proud of that because I'm a gay man myself, and I believe really strongly that LGBT people have just as much to bring to parenting as anybody else in society. And even more importantly, I think that recognising the needs of the children that I've been talking about, recognising their needs, means recognising that we need to cast the net as wide as possible to find the best possible parents to offer those children a family, a home, permanence, stability. Adoption is by no means an easy option. It's inherently less straightforward than having birth children. It needs people from all walks of life to be able to come forward, to step up to the opportunities and the challenges that it brings. And that brings me to something that I think is particularly important about what we do at Scottish Adoption. I mentioned before that Scottish Adoption is an organisation that prides itself on the quality of services that it provides. It recognises that adoption absolutely isn't an event. It is a lifelong journey, a lifelong process. And our commitment as an organisation to providing really good post-adoption support is absolutely critical to our adoption offer. Adoption isn't an isolated event. It isn't something that just happens at the moment when a child moves from one family to another. It's a process that starts way before then, a careful process of planning, of thinking through how the interests of that child are going to be provided for in the long term. And it's a process that endures long after the adoption itself has taken place, because all sorts of issues do arise, that mean that post-adoption support, not just in a few weeks after the adoption, not even in a few months, but for many years afterwards, is a really important part of what any adoption agency needs to provide. We often describe Scottish Adoption as a family, because I think that captures the kinds of relationships we want to build with the families that we work with the children who are adopted into those families. So as I look back during National Adoption Week, it's clear that adoption has changed, is changing. Scottish Adoption has changed and is changing, and it will continue to. And I think it will continue to go from strength to strength as an organisation. But what we do, the core purpose of what we do, the experiences that are involved for those who we work with, those things, those core experiences endure. We may wish as a society that adoption wasn't necessary, that we could get to a stage where it's no longer necessary for organisations like Scottish Adoption to exist. But adoption is necessary. And so it has to be done well. It has to be done thoughtfully. It has to be done sensitively. It has to be done always remembering that there are precious lives and opportunities at stake. It has to be done on the basis always of thinking about the longer term. All these things are crucial. Adoption starts with children, sometimes very young, sometimes older these days, but it doesn't end there. Adoption's for life. Thanks very much.